All right, so I try out this slideshow thing, and we'll see how it works. Don't know yet. There you go. Brave new world. Very exciting. So we're going to talk a little bit about composition. So what does that mean? I'm going to divide it up into two general ways of thinking about it. There's going to be objective composition and subjective composition. What the hell does that even mean? So objective criteria, objective criteria featuring terrible photos. Objective criteria is going to be the first thing I'm going to walk through. And those are things that we can all agree on, right? These are things where if you get 5 photography majors in a room, they are all, for the most part, going to be like, okay, yeah, whoa, hey, spinny, camera positioning on this is bad, right? It's bad, right? Everything's like cattywampus, angles are off. It's terrible, don't do it. If you did this, bad. So objective criteria, number 1, camera positioning. Second one, blur because of focus. So if I zoom in here on, whoa, giant child. If I zoom in here on this, you can see that the face is not in focus, whereas the rather less important thing back there of the ugly Smith & Hawken bench is nice and sharp. Now, is this a photograph of a Smith & Hawken bench? I think that probably we would agree that the subject of this photograph is cute child. But that cute child's not in focus, focus failure on the part of the photographer, on the part of the camera, so blur because of focus. That is distinct from another kind of blur, which is blur because of motion. Remember, again, these are objective things. We look at the picture, we can tell they're there. There's no arguing about it. Nobody's like, no, man, it's really in focus, because like, so this is blur because of motion. I have a little detail here where you can, whoa, get back over here. You can see that on the far side of, happens to be my mother, so don't say nothing bad about her, happens to be my mother's face, is a little blurry because of motion. So while I'm taking the picture, she's like, what are you doing? And so I get that blur on that side. Some of you may be wondering, well, why isn't there blur on the whole damn face? I was using flash. All right, don't ask me that. We'll get into it later. Don't worry about it. So blur because of motion. So objectively, so far, we've had camera positioning. We've had blur because of focus. Remember, her face is out of focus. Background's in focus. And then blur because of motion, where most of the frame is crisp, but part of the frame, or more often a person in the frame, car in the frame, a dog in the frame, a zebra, I don't know, is out of focus. Or, excuse me, is blurry. Not out of focus, blurry, motion blur, different. Color cast. So again, each of these things we can objectively agree about them. You could do them on purpose, right? So I could have my image have a blue color cast. We'll actually look a little bit later at Miki Kohara, who does that to, I think, great effect. But this picture is blue. Whole thing, overall, looking pretty blue. As distinct from this one, which is looking pretty orange. You know, like, okay, maybe there are things in there that are actually orange, but, you know, where is that little guy's head? There he is. That is definitely a white marble bust, not a cheese-colored marble bust. Overall exposure, right? So again, this is not me saying never do this, always, certainly not saying always do this. But we can objectively say, like, this picture, it's dark, right? Whole thing, overall, that's pretty dark. You know, are there parts of it that are not dark? Well, yeah, there are. But overall, the entire exposure is dark, right? So again, when we're talking about photographs, so we're there, we're in critique, we're like, hey, this photograph you made, it is overall dark, right? That's not a, I think it's overall dark. Stop shifting around. That is just, yes, 100%, definitely it is overall dark. Exposure on subject, right? So if this was overall exposure, the whole thing taken as a giant big old picture, whole thing's pretty darn dark. This one, the picture on average, you know, I mean, all of these pictures are terrible freaking pictures. Picture on average, the exposure is not the worst thing that I've ever done, which I don't know, maybe you're like, well, gosh, that's, if you've done things worse than that, maybe I should find another professor. But the picture subject, again, my mother, she's blown out, right? So blown out meaning overexposed, totally like whiteness through the roof. It's like Republican National Convention. So that's, again, something we can all objectively agree on. The subject in this picture is improperly exposed, or is at least very brightly exposed, right? You could have the opposite. You could have an overall picture that was okay. Your subject is in a deep shadow, or a combination of lighting and skin tone, right? So if you have a very light skin-toned subject in a strong light, right? Brighter, more likely to overexpose them. You have a dark skin tone subject in the same light, that may be the proper exposure, right? So it's not about a universal, this is the exposure you should have, period. It's about your subject and that exposure on your subject. My white-ass mother, blown out, too bright. All right, so that is the magic of objective criteria. These are things which are universally agreeable, right? We can all come together, look at them and say, yes, 100%, this is true. So exposure on subject, sort of overall exposure. And again, it's light, it's dark, right? Maybe you could make a strong argument for, I really needed to make this picture this dark for some reason or other, right? I don't know what that reason would be. It looks terrible. But overall exposure is dark. These are the terms we use when discussing our pictures. Color cast, right? So this one, color cast is orange. This one, color cast is blue. Blur because of motion, right? So in the picture, something was moving, and as a result, it's blurry. We'll talk all about how to control this, how to deal with it, why we would use it or not use it later on when we talk about shutter speed. But objective criteria, blur because of motion, blur because of focus, right? So subject, in this case, this cherubic, delightful small child, is out of focus and therefore looks all blurry, not because she's moving, but because my foolish photographer has focused on the background in the scene. So blur because of focus, and lastly, camera positioning. Now this one is, the camera is cockeyed at an angle. We can objectively talk about camera positioning being above, below, to the side, tilted, not tilted, straight ahead, pointing up, any of these things. They are objectively things we can describe about how the picture was taken. So that's objective criteria in composition, and I will be right back with subjective criteria.